The inventory listed the silver, the linens, the seller's stock, the debts, and her, not by name. The solicitor's clerk had written one dependent, female, status unclear, and left it at that, as though she were a piece of furniture whose provenance could not be verified. Nora Glenwick had read that line 4 times before she folded the paper and put it back where she had found it, in the drawer beneath the late Earl's writing desk, between a bottle of dried ink and a letter that had never been sent. She had known, of course, that the estate would be sold. Her father had told her himself 3 weeks before he died, in the halting way of a man who had spent his whole life avoiding difficult conversations and had run out of time to keep doing it. He had reached for her hand across the coverlet. He had said, "Nora, there are things I should have done differently." And then he had slept, and in the morning he had not woken, and the solicitors had arrived by Tuesday. What she had not known, what she had not allowed herself to fully understand, was that the sale had already been completed. That Ashmore Park, the house where she had been born, where her mother had died in the blue bedroom on the 2nd floor, where she had learned to read in the library by the south window, had already passed to someone else. A man she had never met. A man named Gideon War. She had 2 choices, the solicitor explained. She could present herself and her documents, such as they were, and throw herself on the mercy of the new owner, or she could leave. Nora had asked him what the documents would prove, exactly, and the solicitor had looked at the floor in the way that men look at floors when they do not wish to say something aloud. Her father had never formally registered her birth. She was the daughter of the Earl of Dunmore by his 2nd wife, a woman who had died before the marriage, could be entered into certain parish records that had since been destroyed in a fire. There was a letter. Her father had told her about it, had sworn it was somewhere in the house. But the solicitors had not found it, and Nora was not confident enough in the law to know what it would prove even if she did. She was 23 years old. She had 42 pounds, a trunk of clothes, and the intimate knowledge of every room in a house that no longer belonged to her. She chose to stay, but not as herself. The housekeeper position had been advertised in the village. The previous one, Mrs. Sutton, had retired to her sister's house in Cornwall the moment the estate changed hands, and Nora had overheard the steward tell the groundskeeper that the new duke, not a duke, she had corrected herself, an earl, though apparently the man was a duke of somewhere else entirely, had sent word that he needed staff in place before his arrival. No interviews. References preferred but not essential. The position would be filled by whoever was there and competent when he arrived. Nora was there. She was competent. She had run this household for 2 years while her father's health declined. She gave her name as Nora Wells, and presented herself to the under-steward on a Thursday morning. He looked at her hands. She had thought to roughen them with garden work the day before, and then at her face, which she had kept carefully expressionless. And then he had written her name in the ledger and handed her the household keys. The weight of them was extraordinary. She had held those keys before, when they belonged to Mrs. Sutton, but that had been different. That had been help. This was something else entirely, the cold brass weight of a position she was not supposed to hold, in a house she was supposed to have inherited, and the feeling of it sat in her chest somewhere between irony and grief. Gideon War arrived on a Friday afternoon, which was inconsiderate of him. Friday arrivals meant rushed preparations, meals planned for Thursday, that had to be held or adjusted, linens that had been aired and now needed to be aired again. Nora heard the carriage on the gravel and set her face and went to stand with the rest of the household in the entrance hall. He was taller than she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Some older man in a wool coat, someone her father's age, someone who looked like a person who bought estates. Instead, Gideon War was perhaps 32, with a sharp, unreadable face and the particular expression of a man who has traveled a long distance and found the journey not worth the trouble. He looked at the entrance hall, her entrance hall, the one her grandmother had decorated, and his gaze moved across the plasterwork and the portraits and the cold fireplace with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. He looked at the household staff. He looked at Nora last. "You are the housekeeper," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary, not rudely, more in the way of a man who is used to reading ledgers and has noticed a figure that does not quite balance. "Mrs. Wells," he said. "Yes. How long have you been in this position?" She had prepared for this. "I came to Ashmore Park 2 years ago, Your Grace. I assisted Mrs. Sutton in her final years in the role. All of this was true." She had been very careful to prepare only true things. He nodded and moved on, and Nora let out a breath so slowly that no one would have noticed it, and followed him into the house to begin the tour. The difficulty with knowing a house intimately is that you cannot always hide it. She knew which floorboard creaked on the 3rd step of the back stairs. She knew that the blue bedroom door stuck in damp weather and had to be lifted slightly on its hinges to open properly. She knew that the light in the library was best in the morning, and that the east parlor was cold regardless of the season because the chimney drew badly and had done so since 1809. She knew these things in her body, the way you know the dimensions of a room you have lived in for years, automatically, without thought. She caught herself twice in the first week, once when she moved to prevent Gideon Ware from opening the wrong door, the one that had never led to the dining room, regardless of what the layout suggested, and once when she corrected the footman about the placement of the candlesticks without thinking, using a detail so specific that the footman had looked at her strangely. She was more careful after that. The staff accepted her without much question. She was organized, she was fair, she did not shout, and she knew the house. That last part was the one that mattered most to people who had spent years working in it. There was something deeply comforting, she thought, about being managed by someone who understood which drafts came from which windows and why the larder needed to be checked on Tuesdays and not Wednesdays. But what had not accounted for was the portrait. It hung in the long gallery on the 2nd floor, between a painting of her grandfather on horseback and a landscape of the lake in winter. It had been commissioned when Nora was 17, and it showed her in a pale blue dress, standing beside the window that looked out over the formal garden, with one hand resting on the sill and the other holding a book she had not been reading. She had sat for it for 4 mornings in a row and had thought the painter was getting the light entirely wrong. And the painter had told her that the light was exactly as he intended it, and she had decided he was probably right, and she was probably not qualified to judge. She had forgotten about the portrait. She did not forget for long. It was the 2nd Tuesday. Gideon Ware had taken to walking the gallery in the evenings. She did not know why. She did not ask. It was not her business to ask. And she was passing through to check that the wall sconces had been trimmed when she heard him stop. She turned. He was standing in front of the portrait, looking at it with the same focused, arithmetic expression he had used on the entrance hall. Then he turned and looked at her. The likeness, she had been told, was very good. "Mrs. Wells," he said. "Your Grace, who is this?" The question arrived in her chest with a cold, particular precision. She had thought about this moment. She had prepared an answer for this moment. The answer was, "I believe it is the late Earl's daughter, Your Grace. She died some years ago." The staff spoke of her rarely. She said it. She said it perfectly, with exactly the right pitch of respectful uncertainty. He looked at the portrait, and then at her, and then at the portrait again. "I see," he said. He did not say anything else. But he looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel the floor was slightly less solid than it had been. The solicitor arrived the following week. His name was Mr. Farwell, and he was not the solicitor Nora remembered from her father's dealings. That man had retired, but a younger one with a careful manner and a briefcase that seemed to contain an unreasonable number of papers. He met with Gideon War in the study for 2 hours. Nora arranged for tea to be sent in and did not listen at the door because she was not that kind of person, but she did happen to be reorganizing the cabinet in the adjoining room when the conversation became loud enough to carry. The late Earl had left a will. Of course he had. What the will contained, apparently, was the difficulty. He had bequeathed Ashmore Park to his daughter, Nora, subject to certain conditions. The problem, Mr. Farwell's voice was apologetic in the way of a man who has delivered this particular problem before, was that the estate had been sold prior to his death, under terms that superseded the will. He could not bequeath what he had already sold. His daughter, if she existed and could be found and could prove her identity, might have some claim to other assets, but the estate itself was no longer in question. There was a silence. If she existed, said Gideon War, and his voice had a flatness to it that Nora could not quite read. There is some dispute about the registration of the birth, Mr. Farwell said. The Earl indicated in correspondence that he had prepared documentation. A letter, specifically. But another silence. Longer. Thank you, said Gideon War. That will be all. Nora put down the papers she had been holding and stood very still in the adjoining room until she heard Mr. Farwell's footsteps moving toward the entrance hall. She had known for weeks that this was the shape of it. But knowing something and hearing it spoken aloud in a solicitor's voice in her own father's study were different experiences entirely, and she found she needed a moment before she could make herself move. She found the letter 4 days later. It was not where the solicitors had looked. It was not in the desk or the filing cabinet or the lockbox in the bedroom. It was in the library, tucked into the back of the 3rd volume of a set of legal encyclopedias that had not been opened, she suspected, since before she was born. Her father had told her once, in one of his more coherent final weeks, that he had to put something important out somewhere no one would look for it, and she had assumed he was confused. He had not been confused. He had simply had a very particular sense of humor about hiding places. The letter was addressed to her, 12 pages, in her father's handwriting, which had grown shaky toward the end but was still recognizable as his. That particular way he formed his G's, the way he always underlined names as though they might otherwise escape the page. It laid out, in the exhaustive detail of a man who had spent a lifetime in law before he spent the end of it in decline, the circumstances of her birth, her mother's name, the date of the marriage and the parish where it had been recorded, the name of the second parish, where it had been re-recorded after the fire, the name of the witness, now elderly but still living in Edinburgh, the names of 2 solicitors who had been present. It was, in short, everything she needed. She sat on the floor of the library for a long time, holding the letter footsteps in the corridor. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. She had time to stand before the door opened, not time to hide the letter, not time to compose herself entirely. She was standing by the south window, her window, the one from the portrait, with 12 pages of her father's handwriting in her hands, and, she suspected, an expression on her face that was not in any way consistent with the role of housekeeper. Gideon War stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. He looked at the window, and then at her face, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of a man having a realization in a novel, but in the quiet, settling way of a man whose arithmetic has finally balanced. "Mrs. Wells," he said. Then, after a pause, "Or not." She could have maintained it. She had enough control left to maintain it. But the letter was in her hands, and her father's handwriting was in front of her, and she was standing at the window she had stood at, when she was 17, and someone had told her the light was exactly right, and she was very tired. "My name is Nora Glenwick," she said. "My father was the Earl of Dunmore. I was born in this house and I have lived in it for 23 years. And I apologize for the deception, Your Grace. I did not know what else to do." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known about the letter?" 4 days. "And before that?" "I knew it existed. I didn't know if I would find it." He came into the room and stood with his hands behind his back and looked out the window at the garden for a while. The garden had gone untended at the edges, and Nora had been meaning to speak to the groundskeeper about it, but had not yet found the right moment. She noticed this now, absurdly, while she waited to find out what her life would be. "The solicitor said your father's daughter might have a claim," Gideon War said, "to assets other than the estate. I know. That letter, if it establishes your identity, would support that claim. I believe so." He turned from the window and looked at her directly, not in the way he had been looking at her since he arrived, that careful, calculating look, but in a different way, more straightforward. "Why didn't you simply present yourself?" he said, "when I arrived?" Or before. She thought about this. She had thought about it many times, actually, in the weeks she had spent carrying the household keys and directing the footmen, and pretending she had learned the dimensions of this house from Mrs. Sutton rather than from her own childhood. "Because I had nothing to prove who I was," she said, "and a woman who arrives at a house she cannot prove she owns and announces herself as its rightful heir is not a woman who tends to be believed, Your Grace. She is a woman who tends to be removed." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not wrong," he said, and then, unexpectedly, "The portrait is a very good likeness." Something loosened slightly in her chest. She was not sure why. The painter was very thorough. There was a man named Harwick. He arrived on a Thursday, which was becoming, Nora thought, an ominous day of the week. He was a cousin of her father's, distant, unpleasant in the way of a man who has spent years calculating his inheritance, and he came with his own solicitor and a set of documents that he described as establishing a prior claim and Nora's own solicitor. She had found one in the village, a competent woman named Mrs. Branch, who had handled property disputes for 30 years, described as remarkably creative fiction. Harwick's position was that Nora's birth had never been properly established, that the Earl's letter was an elderly man's fancy, and that whatever assets remained from the estate ought to revert to the nearest male heir, which was, by his calculation, himself. He said this in the study, which was her father's study, where her father had sat for 20 years and handled the affairs of the earldom, and Nora sat across from him and said nothing, and let Mrs. Branch speak, which was the right tactical choice, but required a considerable amount of self-control. Gideon War sat to the side and said nothing at all, which should have been a relief and somehow was not. Harwick's solicitor made his arguments. Mrs. Branch refuted them. Harwick looked at Nora with the particular expression of a man who does not like being argued with by women and is trying to decide how to make that known without saying it. "The property has already been sold," Gideon War said during a pause. His voice was calm. "My ownership of the estate is not in question." Harwick turned to him. "Of course not, but the question of what was owed to the Earl's daughter before the sale is a question for the courts," Gideon War said, "which is, I believe, what Mrs. Branch has been explaining." "I merely think," Harwick said, and his voice had taken on the particular slickness of a man who is about to say something he intends to regret later, "that the word of a woman presenting herself under a false name in a household she has already." "That's enough," said Gideon War. It was not said loudly. Gideon War did not appear to be the kind of man who needed to say things loudly, but something in the flatness of it landed in the room like a door closing, and Harwick stopped. "I have read the letter," Gideon War said. I have read the documents Mrs. Branch has assembled. I have also spoken with the Earl's former steward, who knew Miss Glenwick from her childhood and has confirmed her identity in writing. The matter is clear enough." He looked at Harwick with the arithmetic expression. "I suggest you take your solicitor home." Harwick left. It took longer than Nora would have liked, because he needed to collect himself and his papers and make several remarks about the inadequacy of the legal system and the general unreliability of women. But he left, and the sound of his carriage on the gravel was one of the better sounds Nora had heard in several months. She stood in the entrance hall, after the door in her pocket. The household keys were in. She had been carrying them for 6 weeks. "You didn't have to do that," she said, when Gideon War came to stand nearby. "I was presented with the facts, and I stated them," he said. "That's not particularly heroic. You didn't have to believe me." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "The portrait," he said, "was a very good likeness. Spring came to Ashmore Park the way it always had, which was slowly, and then all at once. The oaks at the end of the long drive budding in April. The kitchen garden producing its first tentative growth by May, the lake going silver and then blue in the light of mornings that arrived earlier and earlier until suddenly it was fully light at 5. And Nora had been awake for an hour already, standing at the window of the room she had moved into after Harwick's visit, a room that was not the housekeeper's room and was not quite her own room and did not yet have a name, and watching the water. The legal matter resolved itself by June. The parish records were found in Edinburgh, as her father's letter had promised. The witness was located, aged 84 and sharp as anything, who told the solicitor she remembered the Earl's marriage perfectly well and had been wondering when someone would bother to ask. The assets, a separate account, investments her father had maintained independently of the estate, were confirmed as Nora's. She was not rich, but she was not nothing. She had been thinking about leaving. She had thought about it since Harwick's visit, since the evening Gideon War had sat across from her in the study and said, "The matter is clear enough," and she had felt something in her chest she did not fully want to name. It seemed safer to leave. Cleaner. She could find rooms in Edinburgh, perhaps, near the solicitors who had helped settle the matter. She could find a life that did not require her to walk past the library every morning and remember her father's handwriting. She told Gideon War on a Thursday, because apparently that was when important things happened now. He was in the garden, the east side, where the roses had been allowed to grow wild along the stone wall in a way that was either romantic or neglectful depending on your perspective, and Nora had stopped trying to decide which. He had taken to walking there in the late afternoon. She did not know why. She had stopped pretending she did not. Notice. "I'm planning to leave at the end of the month," she said. "I wanted to give adequate notice." He turned from the roses. He looked at her in the direct way he had been looking at her since the afternoon in the library. "Where will you go?" "Edinburgh, perhaps." "I have connections there now." Connections. The solicitors, the witness, an 84-year-old woman and a set of lawyers. They are quite good lawyers. He was quiet for a moment. A bird somewhere in the roses made a sound and stopped. "You could stay," he said. It was said in the same calm, flat tone he used for everything, and for a moment she thought she had misunderstood it, that it was a practical observation, a logistical suggestion. She could stay and manage the household, perhaps. She could stay in some professional capacity that could be explained to the staff and the solicitors and the world. "In what capacity?" she said carefully. He turned and looked at her fully, the way he had in the library. "In the capacity of someone I would very much prefer not to watch leave." The roses smelled like early summer. The lake was catching the light. Somewhere on the other side of the garden wall she could hear the groundskeeper working, the steady sound of someone who had jobs to do and was doing them, and the world was ordinary and ongoing and entirely indifferent to the fact that she was standing in the garden of her father's house with the man who owned it and trying to understand what was happening in her chest. "That is not a capacity," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I'm suggesting a different one." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the portrait, she had been standing at a window and not reading a book, and the painter had said the light was exactly right, and she had decided he was probably correct, and she was probably not qualified to judge. She was beginning to think she might be more qualified than she had given herself credit for. "Tell me what you're suggesting," she said. And he did. They married in September, in the chapel, on the grounds that her grandfather had built and her father had never quite gotten around to maintaining. So the morning light came in through a window with a crack in the leading that threw a slightly imperfect pattern on the stones. Nora had decided she preferred it to a perfect window. It seemed more honest. Mrs. Branch attended. The Edinburgh solicitors sent a letter. The 84-year-old witness, whose name was Mrs. Arnott and who had opinions about everything, attended in person and told Nora afterward that she had excellent posture and the Earl would have been pleased. Nora thought he probably would have been. She thought about him that morning in the way she had learned to think about him, not with the sharp edge of the first months, but with something quieter, so the sfarp thing. He had been a man who did things late and imperfectly and with great difficulty, and he had loved her in the way that some people love, which is to say badly and genuinely, and without quite enough clarity, and he had tried at the end to make it right. The letter had been enough. It had done what he meant it to do. The household keys lived on a hook in the study now. They had passed to Mrs. Dunmore, the new housekeeper, a capable woman from the village who had started in January and had needed to be told only twice about the floorboard on the third step of the back stairs. Nora walked past them every morning on her way to the library, where the light was best, where her father's legal encyclopedias still stood in their row on the shelf with the third volume slightly out of alignment, and she read there in the mornings and thought in the afternoons, and watched the seasons move across the garden that had always been hers. The house stood, as it had always stood. The oaks were older by 1 year. At the edge of the kitchen garden, inexplicably, a single rose had seeded itself in the spring and grown through the summer and bloomed in October, when roses had no business blooming. One late, stubborn, orange flower that the groundskeeper had reported to Nora with the expression of a man who considered it a personal affront. She had told him to leave it. It was still there when the first frost came, which should not have been possible and was anyway.